This episode is sponsored by PAX, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PAX. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of personal care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PAX absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast even in low light. With over 200 designs, PAX bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together no matter the setup. PAX doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PAX are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pax/bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm back here with Radu Venter, who goes under the pseudonym of Paramedic Philosopher on Substack. We're tackling today another one of his excellent blog posts. Today we're looking really at one of his blog posts titled "The Real Learning Begins on the Job." And in this blog post, Radu really denotes the crucial learning happens during really on the job practice, but there is also just counterbalance of having a number of educational concepts play into the foundation of principled learning, but actually the real learning does occur on the job. And we're going to dig into the blog shortly. Radu, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
So it's a fantastic read. There's many facets of this which play out in practice, and you really argue for more leadership, conflict resolution, inclusivity into curriculum. But can I get you to speak to just the origin of why you wrote the blog in the first place?
A lot of this post kind of comes from a combination of my experience as a newer paramedic, coupled with the schooling that I ended up getting to do my advanced care paramedic. And so the way the system in Alberta works, the way it currently works, I should say, actually, because there's going to be a couple of changes in the next couple of years. But the initial schooling to become a primary care paramedic is fairly quick. So it focuses very heavily on the skill set and background knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily focus as much on the softer skills, the flexibility and things of that nature. And so for those of us who are moving forward to the advanced care, those programs tend to be a little bit longer, generally 1.5 to 2 years. So there's a little more room in there for the quote unquote fluff, as a lot of people like to call it, the real learning bits and pieces. And I remember thinking to myself that it's a shame that we don't front load a lot of this in the primary care paramedic program, or just for anyone just starting out, because we can't trust that the quote unquote real learning that I refer to, the critical thinking, the open-mindedness, the conflict resolution skills, you can't guarantee that these things actually will be learned on the job. A lot of it just happens to be, were you lucky enough to have this experience prior to? So in my background in schooling, I did a lot more critical thinking before I ever got to the paramedic world. Others might have more practical training with regards to, supervising staff, practical learning styles and techniques and things of that nature. But you can't guarantee that as a paramedic, you're going to end up with somebody who is a good mentor for these skills and these capabilities. And so it kind of puts the newer practitioners at a kind of unknown risk to either end up with very rigid, very closed-minded, or potentially individuals who have been on the job a little bit too long. Maybe they're dealing with stressors, burnout, things of that nature, and they might unintentionally pick up bad habits, bad kind of approaches to things, while at the same time thinking, oh no, this is conflict resolution. Well, it's a form of conflict resolution, but it's far more blunt and it's far more problematic and will potentially lead to stressors, not just between paramedics themselves, between paramedics and the healthcare system as a whole. And that's kind of where this whole article essentially came from is if you come and practice and the first thing you start hearing is, oh, you're done your practicum, now the real learning begins kind of thing. And it strikes me as kind of a failure of our education to touch on the elements that matter. Yes, I can start IVs by the time I'm done my practicum, but are we spending enough time focusing on being able to do the stuff that really matters, quote unquote, really matters on a lot of the calls is the ability to communicate with your partner, the ability to interact with other allied practitioners, other responders, things of that nature, the ability to be proud of ourselves and realize just how much our individual interaction with a patient can color their entire healthcare process, not just today, but ongoing. If, our approach is, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of rough conflict resolution approach, will that person call 911 again? Because, oh, well, the last time the paramedics were really mean and disregarded what I had. So if I, call for this chest pain that I'm experiencing right now, maybe they'll just discount it again. And so that's where I kind of push expanding more on these soft skills, expanding more on the, again, as I refer to it, fluff. That's what a lot of people tend to think about it. And I was lucky enough in my advanced care program to have an instructor who did a fantastic job, not necessarily giving us the answers, but introducing so many of these concepts. Um, so specifically one day we were discussing leadership and he put up all these pieces of paper around the classroom and wrote some words and said, what do you guys think of it? And in one of them, he wrote servant. And so everyone saw that more as, it's more passive, it's the lower on the hierarchy, things of that nature. And he was able to use that as a moment to show, well, can a leader not also be a servant? Can a leader not just show up and say, hey, what do you guys need? Kind of thing, and then kind of merge into that situation from there. Are they showing up on a call where everything is perfectly managed, but the patient needs pain medication beyond what a primary care paramedic can provide? Perfect. There's no need to take over the scene. There's no need to, override everything that's already been done. Or is it the exact opposite where they show up and it's an absolute catastrophe? And it's that moment where, oh, looks like everything's kind of fallen off the bandwagon. All right, we're going to get this going, we're going to get this going, we're going to get this going, and create a system or an environment where, these individuals can reflect on what is my approach and what is the benefit or potential drawback from it. And this way we could create much more nuanced, much more competent, much more cooperative, much easier paramedics to work with and save a lot of paramedics from a lot of those hurdles or the speed bumps along the way as, oh, well, I was taught or I wasn't taught, but the culture as a whole expects the advanced care paramedic to show up, start barking orders, and I can do that. Well, yes, but it might take somebody a few months to realize, oh, the one coworker that never misses an IV seems to miss IVs when I'm doing it, when I'm there. And maybe that's because they're so nervous or stressed out by the approach that I have, by the leadership style that I've picked, that maybe by coming in and saying, hey, we need an IV, but don't worry, if you can't get it, let me know. I have backups ready to go. Perfect. Now they can take, you know, a little bit of stress off of their shoulders and they know that if they get the IV perfect, we move forward. And if not, there's other stuff that can be done so that there's not as much unnecessary pressure or unnecessary stress on the other coworkers, and we could drastically improve just the overall culture of the profession as a whole.
Listen, I agree with that, Radu. And one of the aspects you write in the blog is, these critical interpersonal skills shouldn't be reserved, as you're saying, for advanced care practitioners. They are generic skills ahead of time for primary care practitioners, essentially out of the gate, and actually to smooth, like you said, the non-technical skills and just the whole ethos on scene. These skills and all these modalities of communication, the concept of leadership, conflict resolution, coming to shared understandings, human factors mitigation, all these things apply to every scene. They're not mutually exclusive to advanced care or indeed critical care. And, embedding them early on and like you say, fostering them, affirming them, bringing them up in debrief, I think in a way it sort of highlights how important they are for every scene. And so just as before we hear the blog in narrative AI format, did you have any post blog reflections at all?
Not as much necessarily in terms of reflection, but I haven't heard exactly what the plan is. I know that Alberta is moving towards more of a degree program, and it'll be interesting to see how they manage bringing this stuff in earlier, and expanding on it because now they'll have more time to add not just the main skills and competencies that are required, but now they can focus a little more on these sort of they're perceived to be side skills, but in my mind they're more important. I've often said that I'd rather work with the most incompetent practitioner that I can work with, knowing that they can talk to me and we can interact, and knowing that, okay, well, harder IV starts are probably going to be me, but it's good for me to know, than to work with somebody who's very rigid, very, no, I've got this. No, I'm, you know, much more confrontative, much more rigid and difficult to work with. And and I think the sooner we can start to teach these things, because yeah, as you said, and as I've definitely experienced, it's a shame that we're not introducing this much sooner. Because if you never intend to take your advanced care, well, then you won't get exposure to this set of concepts and ideas. And even if you get into your advanced care, perhaps by the time these concepts are being introduced, it's working against a foundation that you've already built over such a length of time that it's much harder to bring down, and it's much harder to adjust to. So yeah, I don't know exactly what the timeline or the planning is for it, but I'm very curious to see how much of this real learning we can introduce much sooner before you actually get to the job, so that it has time to plant the seeds and see how many of them can come to fruition before then.
Listen, it's fantastic to catch up with you, Radu. You're just about to hear the blog. Thanks for writing it. We'll put it in the link in the show notes for people to go away and read it as well as listen. It's always great to catch up with you.
Thank you.
Welcome to the deep dive. If you spent any time at all in a high pressure job, maybe emergency services, healthcare, engineering, even running a startup, you've probably heard that saying. The real learning begins on the job.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And it's interesting, right? Because it kind of suggests that, well, the initial training didn't quite cut it.
Exactly.
And when we looked into your sources,
Yeah.
especially focusing on paramedic education, which is such a critical field, this saying, it always seems to carry this tension. Is school just too short? Or is it maybe completely out of touch with reality?
Well, that's really our mission today. We want to figure out what that gap actually looks like, between the classroom and the street. And we're using paramedics as our main case study here.
Mhm.
We're not just asking what's missing from the training. We're digging into why just relying on, well, the chaos of the real world to fill those gaps is actually pretty dangerous for everyone involved, the new paramedic and, critically, the patient.
Right. We need to sort of pull apart the truth from both sides of that saying.
So where do we start? Why do so many people feel like the real learning only happens once they're out there?
Well, what's clear right away is that people saying this aren't usually trying to be negative. They're just observing what happens. Current schooling, especially in fields like paramedicine, it's really geared towards teaching you how to, let's say, fix the machine.
Okay.
It focuses heavily on specific clinical skills.
Yeah.
When to use a defibrillator, how to figure out drug doses, and all the background knowledge you need to actually do those things safely.
But the moment they leave that classroom, that controlled setting,
Everything changes. They hit the street and realize the patient isn't a machine at all. They're a person a complex, often unpredictable person, usually in some kind of chaotic situation.
Right. That's a huge disconnect.
It is, and it happens immediately. The sources really hammer this home. Pretty much every paramedic learns very quickly that no plan survives contact with the patient.
Ha! Yeah, I bet.
In class, the scenarios, they're clean. The instructor feeds you the symptoms, you follow the steps. But out there, you get a patient whose symptoms barely match the textbook. And, the simulated patients in school, they do what you tell them.
Oh.
Real people. They might be scared, angry, totally uncooperative. Plus, you've often got family members there, maybe panicked, maybe questioning everything you do. The conditions are just worlds apart from where they learn.
Okay, but hang on. They spent years in school, right? Surely they have basic communication skills. What specifically is missing? What can't the textbook teach them?
That's the key. It's the really high-stakes soft skills that often get overlooked. Communication isn't just about talking clearly. It's about navigating these, huge emotional gaps, sometimes generational gaps, all while under intense pressure.
So give me an example.
Okay, well, think about this. You might have a brand new paramedic, maybe 22 years old, and suddenly they're the one in charge, trying to communicate really serious health information to someone who's, say, 85, with maybe 3 worried adult children standing right there, challenging every decision. That's not something you practice easily in a classroom.
Wow. Yeah. That's intense. And I guess the communication isn't just medical jargon, is it? It gets personal, heavy stuff.
Absolutely. The sources really stress this. Things like needing to discuss suicidal thoughts or addiction, or telling someone their family members just passed away, and doing it with some kind of grace, some authority, even when you're terrified inside.
Yeah.
There's this one story, an anecdote in the sources that really jumped out at me. A paramedic mentioned they were 2 whole years into the job.
Yeah.
2 years before they actually had to be the one to tell someone their loved one had died.
2 years. Wow. That seems like such a core, albeit awful part of the job.
It is. And what this paramedic reflected on was profound. They realized they had basically zero framework. Nothing from their formal education gave them any sort of guideline on how to handle that incredibly delicate, irreversible moment.
So they were just winging it.
Pretty much, relying on instinct, maybe luck. They felt they only managed it okay because, purely by chance, they'd taken some optional course on grief counseling years before. But the main takeaway was clear. A critical, unavoidable part of their job demanded this highly specialized skill, and the main curriculum just skipped it.
Okay, so learning isn't just about knowing stuff. It's also about knowing what you don't know. And if school isn't really tackling these crucial soft skills, crisis communication, leadership, managing emotions, then what are we assuming will just magically happen on the job? What assumptions are we making that might be flawed?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? If we zoom out a bit, relying on the job itself to teach these complex skills, it kind of rests on 4 big assumptions. And unfortunately, these assumptions often fall flat, which creates real risks.
Okay, walk me through them. What's the first big failure point?
The first one is what we could call the awareness gap. Learning on the job assumes the practitioner even realizes there's something more they need to learn.
Right.
But if a complex concept, maybe a tricky ethical situation or a different way to lead a team, or even just a more flexible way to handle a patient if that was never even mentioned in school, even just theoretically, well, the new person doesn't know it exists. They don't know what they don't know.
So they just keep doing things the way they were initially taught.
Exactly. They stick within that limited box.
Mm-hmm.
If you're only ever taught one way to run a call, you might never even think that other, maybe better ways are possible. It limits your growth right from the start.
You can't adapt if you don't even know adaptation is an option. Okay, what's the second flawed assumption?
That's the mentorship lottery.
Yeah.
So the assumption is, okay, once the person does realize they need to learn more, they'll be able to find someone good at work to learn from, a good source of information or practice.
But that's not guaranteed.
Not at all. It's really variable. Not everyone gets lucky and finds that amazing progressive mentor or preceptor who really invests in them. You might get paired with someone who's totally burned out or relies on practices that are decades old, or frankly, just sees the new person as a hassle.
Yeah, the lottery part sounds about right. And if you lose that lottery, you're not just missing out on good learning, you might actually be learning bad habits, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the third point.
Precisely. That's the cultural pitfall. Without some kind of conscious framework for what professional excellence looks like, something taught and reflected on, new practitioners, almost inevitably just absorb the dominant culture of their team or workplace.
And that culture might not be great.
It might be cynical, maybe distrustful of management, maybe you're prone to taking shortcuts. And the new person, wanting to fit in, wanting to survive, often mistakes that cynicism for, like, street smarts or competence. So they adopt those attitudes, those habits.
It's kind of a law.
Yeah. Regardless of whether it's actually good for patients or for their own long-term well-being. The job basically socializes them, sometimes in negative ways, before it truly educates them on these nuances.
That's actually kind of scary. Thinking a bright-eyed new practitioner could end up jaded just by trying to fit in. Okay, what's the last assumption that often fails?
It's the opportunity constraint. This one's pretty simple. It assumes the new paramedic will actually get the chance out in the field to develop and practice these specialized high-stakes skills.
But those situations are rare, hopefully.
Exactly. High-stakes scenarios, complex calls, mass casualty incidents. Thankfully, they don't happen every day. You can't just wait around for a major disaster so your team can practice leadership dynamics under pressure.
Right.
You need a safer space, like a simulation back in school, to even introduce concepts like managing flexibility or resolving team conflict before they face it for real when the stakes are incredibly high. Otherwise, they might only ever practice the routine stuff and never build the capacity for complexity.
This really flips the script then. If the field is too risky, too random, too dependent on luck for developing these crucial non-clinical skills, then school really has to be the place. It needs to be that safe space for development.
It has to be.
So if we are redesigning things, if we wanted to build this curriculum, what would that look like? How do you actually teach these kinds of skills in a classroom?
Well, a huge piece has to be prioritizing communication, but going way beyond just how to talk to patients. We need to focus intensely on interprofessional skills, meaning how to effectively interact with everyone else involved, the nurses, the doctors, police, firefighters, teaching students how to engage in a way that fosters collaboration, not, competition or defensiveness.
Okay, but how do you teach that specifically? Role play.
That's part of it, but it's deeper. It's about teaching the ability to ask questions with a genuine desire to learn, not just to challenge someone. And critically, it's teaching the capacity to give constructive feedback to a partner or coworker without making it sound like a personal attack. And maybe even harder, learning how to receive feedback without immediately getting defensive. These are the absolute bedrock skills for teamwork in any crisis.
I noticed the sources really seem to emphasize that kind of horizontal communication, talking across the team, not just down to the patient or up to a doctor. Why is that so often missed?
Because it requires managing your ego.
Right.
And that's not usually chapter 7 in the textbook. Think about leadership skills. A good curriculum has to force students to actually confront and explore different styles of leadership.
Not just the command and control style.
Exactly. We need to get past the idea that a leader has to be this authoritarian figure barking orders. We should be discussing things like, can a leader serve the team? Can they lead by building consensus? Should they open things up for input? Or is there a time when they absolutely must make the call? Giving them that toolkit before they're suddenly in charge under fire is crucial.
And conflict resolution feels like the flip side of that coin. It's not just about arguing your point better.
No, it's that dual skill, isn't it? Yeah. Being able to appropriately, professionally, bring up a concern you have about patient care, and at the same time being able to really hear when someone else raises a concern about your actions. Realizing that maybe, just maybe, you got tunnel vision, you became kind of blinded by the situation.
That self-awareness, realizing you might be wrong.
That's the absolute core of humility in practice. And that brings us to those fundamental attitudes, the professional character traits that school really needs to actively cultivate.
How do you grade someone on character, though?
You don't grade the character itself, maybe, but you grade their engagement with it, their willingness to reflect, to discuss, to practice these attributes in simulated scenarios, and to reflect on their own performance afterwards.
Okay, so let's list those final critical attributes that came up in the sources. What needs to be part of this soft skills curriculum?
First, genuine open-mindedness. The curriculum has to pound this home. There's often more than one right way to manage a symptom or move a patient or solve a problem unseen. If you train people to think there's only one right way, they basically stop learning the day they graduate.
Makes sense. Then humility.
Absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Knowing that no matter how many years you've been doing this, there's always more to learn. And crucially, that anyone, even the person who just started last week, might be the one you learn it from. That takes a conscious effort, to not always think you're the expert in the room.
Okay. What else?
We also need to instill pride. Not arrogance, that's different, but real pride in the profession itself and pride in your coworkers. Understanding that how one of you acts reflects on everyone. If you have that professional pride, you'll naturally hold yourself and others to a higher standard.
And the last one was inclusivity.
Yes, so important. The necessity of being genuinely welcoming and gracious to people who are newer or maybe less experienced, remembering they're the future, and everyone started somewhere. School is the ideal place to teach people how to be a good mentor before they're ever asked to be one unprepared in the field.
So if the training environment actively encourages this kind of reflective practice, simulations, where the debrief isn't just about did the patient live, but about how did we communicate? What leadership style did I use? What did I miss? Then these attitudes start to become ingrained. They become professional habits.
That's the goal.
So wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for you, the listener? It seems the real tension isn't learning versus not learning. It's learning passively, by chance, just hoping you get lucky on the job with the right calls and the right people, versus learning actively, intentionally, and safely in an educational setting that prepares you for the messy human side of stressful jobs.
Exactly. And, while we focused on paramedicine because it's such a clear, high-stakes example, this whole idea of book smarts versus reality, the need for proactive soft skill training, it really applies across the board. Any high-pressure field, any major career transition you might go through. If your education or your onboarding only focuses on the technical what and ignores the collaborative human how, well, you're likely being set up for a much tougher, maybe more painful adjustment period.
Which leads to maybe a final thought, something for you to really chew on after this deep dive. If our professional education systems don't explicitly prioritize teaching, and yes, even grading these essential attitudes like humility and pride and inclusivity, how likely is it really that the culture out in the field will just magically develop those traits on its own? You could easily find yourself stuck in a cycle, right, where the job keeps reinforcing the very culture, maybe cynical, maybe exclusionary, that the initial education failed to counteract in the first place.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.